resilience, one practice that's key to that is pushing our limits a bit, trying ourselves, testing ourselves in an environment that we know is supportive. And we are certainly practicing that this morning. Thank you all for that. Recently, I saw a hillside in the forest that had just endured a windstorm. The direction the wind had blown was obvious. From the hillside now lay. Even though strong, the strength of those individual trees failed in the gusts of wind that they had to endure. These giants had fallen. At the same time, I noticed the open spaces on the hillside were covered in tall grasses, now gently waving in the wind, brushing against one another, supported by one another, as they continued to stand, taking in the sunlight, the air and water, and continuing to grow. It didn't seem fair somehow. Those beautiful trees had fallen, yet the grasses remained. At the same time, I was grateful the winds had not been able to strip the hillside of life, that the grasses would persist, holding the soil so that other life could continue or reestablish itself. I'd have to describe that biological community of the hillside as being resilient, even if some of the trees were lost. We individual humans can also be resilient, learning how to move about in spite of the strong prevailing winds, learning strategies to maintain ourselves even as time and experience bring wear and tear. We also find this resilience in our communities. Studies of the responses of communities to natural disasters show this in action. We can see how our communities respond with civil engineering such as flood control, better bridges, improved communications, and adapting new practices to improve how the next disaster can be handled better. There are also spiritual and psychological components to this. The fortunate community will also develop stronger neighborhood ties, built from elements ranging from sidewalk chats to corner coffee shops where folks can meet, and other elements of the social infrastructure. That social infrastructure can be every bit as important as the physical one. Now, we each have our own innate resilience as human beings. We each have some degree of social competence, problem-solving skills, our autonomy, and a sense of purpose or belief in a future. These are not some magical properties gifted only to a few. They're properties we each and all have. We have these in common to varying degrees, with varying levels of skill in wielding them. We may not be aware of these skills and abilities, of course. We might have even been raised in environments that did not exercise all of these traits or even discourage them. We may have been raised to encourage one or more of these traits, or in our life experience, wandered into environments that encourage us to stretch and develop these traits further. The development that is called stress hardiness, developing resilient traits in response to a very adverse environment. A benign or supportive environment can also encourage these resilient traits through various challenges raised to individuals to encourage them to stretch a bit, to discover new capabilities and operate at the edges of our comfort zones. That seems to be my experience here today. A little stretch. Now, resilience in individuals seems to arise from the interactions of individuals with their community, whether adverse, supportive, or a mixture of both. Now, longer ago than I care to think, I was in the military service. Recruit training was a classic example of an adverse environment, tailored to break down old behaviors and habits and build new ones that would be supportive of the community of fellow service members. It was definitely a shock to my system. But I learned I had far more capacity for resilience in the face of adversity than I had ever conceived of prior to my service. In some ways it was adverse, and in some ways it was actually supportive in a very odd way. It's an interesting experience. Now, while assigned to a training command as an instructor in Idaho, I happened to have a long weekend, almost 5 days, turn up in my schedule. It seemed like a great opportunity to return to the Bay Area to visit family. My partner at the time and I hopped into our mighty AMC Hornet. Oh, you know what's coming, don't you? And taking turns driving, took on the 13-hour journey. We made it, enjoyed our visits, and then we were back in the car for the return trip. Somewhere about 30 miles west of Elko, Nevada, billowing white clouds started appearing behind the car. Warning lights popped on the dashboard, and the engine temperature gauge, remember those? Pegged high. None of those were good signs. We pulled over. I got out and flagged down a truck and got a lift into Elko. This is before cell phones. We found a shop and got the vehicle towed. After a new water pump, several $100s, and several hours, we were on the road again. Well, for a little while. My resilience was being tested here. That Hornet's engine is a delicate thing. It turns out it's not resilient. It does not respond well to overheating. About 20 miles east of Elko, the engine started running rough. Those billowing white clouds were back. Another thumbed ride, another tow, and that evening the vehicle was back in Elko. We were getting to know this town. We were parked on a side street besides the now closed garage. Now, my resilience was clearly being tested by all of this. I was an inch from breaking down in tears. I called my command from a payphone to explain that I was not going to be present in time for my shift, which was to start in about 6 hours. They were surprisingly understanding. They found a volunteer to take over my class there. Even more surprising, an instructor who was on their day off offered to drive to Elko, pick us up and our luggage, and take us back to Pocatello, Idaho, where we were living at the time. That was remarkable. A week later, I had another 2 days off coming up, and an instructor asked about the vehicle and suggested we take his truck to Elko and tow the Hornet back to my place. I had not recognized it at the time, but I was not alone. I was not a lone individual. I was part of a fairly tight-knit community of folks who looked out for each other, supported one another, and exercised their problem-solving skills, their autonomy, and their sense of purpose for the benefit of our little community. All of us were bound together by our common service and oath. This was a remarkably eye-opening experience for me. I had been alone much of my life. Now I realized that even though I was in this situation, my resilience was being taxed. This community, with its abundance of resilience, took the difficulties in stride, supported me, lifted me up, and quite literally got me on the road again. I also became far too familiar with that car's engine, although I did get it running again. Now, here at Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church, we have a community holding common interests in faith, in our desire for social justice, and in many ways by the support we give one another, and bound together by our covenant. While we're not living our lives under one roof or forming a commune, I still have a strong feeling of being part of an intentional community here. Many of these same elements of resilience that I mentioned earlier are present within this community. We, within the membership and our committees, have teams that demonstrate and teach social competence, problem-solving skills, autonomy, and a sense of purpose, of belief in the future. We have a benign and supportive environment that encourages us all to stretch a bit, to know that others may catch us should we fall. It's okay. We have the shared wisdom here of our doctors of durability, our elders with their collected life experience. We have caregivers tending to our needs, both physical and spiritual. We have the energy and enthusiasm of our youth. We have friends. This is a remarkable place. I think I'm prone to taking this for granted far too often. It's just amazing to me. And considering the impact that this community has had on my own ability to rebound from adverse circumstances, my resilience, I have to pause and thank you all. Now, Carol Sue Kane recently wrote something that resonated with me. Humans are wired for connection, and it takes intention and awareness to prevent the effortless connections with people like me from hindering or harming the more difficult connections I need to create with all the people not like me. Now, it's the hope of these more difficult connections, not with people like me, but with people like those I've admired in my past, those who happen to be Unitarian Universalists, with people who have different insights into life, with people who have all these different life skills. This is what drew me here and what keeps me here. Well, what do I find? I've managed to become part of another community of folks who look out for each other, support one another, and exercise their problem-solving skills, autonomy, and sense of purpose for the benefit of all in the community. And I don't even have to wear a uniform. I found myself in community again, with a found family and a band of generous and amazing people. It is these more difficult connections, not with people like ourselves, but sharing common goals and community that give us our resilience as a community. There are many people gathered here, so many backgrounds, so many paths through life, many unique sets of skills, many beliefs, and yet we are bound together by our common covenant. Daniel Lurch of the Post-Carbon Institute says the key to resilience is understanding that every life and every community is comprised of a system of relationships. And the resilience of any one system is influenced by the resilience of every system around it. Key to our system of relationships is our covenant, which governs how we interact with one another and defines how the right relationships that tie us together should function. That covenant is a remarkable thing, written by our membership. We, the members of the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church, covenant with one another to act in the following ways in our interactions and in all forms of communication. We speak and write directly, openly, and respectfully with one another. We support and encourage diversity within our congregation. We trust each other's best intentions. We respect our healthy boundaries. We honor our community decisions. Our covenant is our social glue, defining the ways we interact and encouraging our flexibility, adaptability, and trust over a rigid or brittle structure. This covenant eases our making connections with those different from ourselves, which I need in developing my own resilience. It is through these connections that I'm able to explore different viewpoints, different approaches to living life, and coping with things I've not been able to do on my own. I know that when I'm near my limits, that often all it takes to bounce back is to chat with a friend here, catch a smile or compliment, often an offer to share a burden, somehow touching that web of connections, and I may feel renewed. That mutual respect and trust weaves us together. It is this web of connection that provides us with our resilience, both individually and as a community. This is something we may all practice, and with this, gain resilience for both ourselves and our community. Remember that hillside. Rather than standing alone against the wind, hoping we won't be broken like those fallen trees, let us be more like those grasses waving in the breeze, touching and supporting one another and rebounding as the storm passes. Let us together be the ones to make it so.